Welcome, everyone. Hello. Nice to have you all here. Thanks for joining us today for the RELO Andes webinar. I'm Kati Casto. I'm an English language specialist, and I'm here with Duff Johnston, the English language fellow in Peru. Thanks for joining us. Today we're talking all about formative assessment. So we're getting started here. If you're joining us live, please jump into the comments and let us know who you are, where you're joining from, where in the world are you, and we'll get started here.
Hello, Jenny from La Paz. Welcome.
Hi, Jenny. So just a quick reminder, we host these webinars on the third Thursday of each month. So make sure that you're following on Facebook to see what's coming up from month to month.
Colombia, Peru. Miriam, Christian, welcome. Good to see a strong regional representation here.
Definitely. Hello. So let us know, where are you joining from today? Hello. Greetings.
Hello,
from
Marlita. Yeah. And Danny, another Bolivian guest.
Yeah, wow. The Andes region really showing up today. Hi.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. Where are you joining from, Duff?
I'm here from Lima, Peru. I'm in the Miraflores district near the ocean.
Oh, that sounds lovely.
And Katie, I don't know if your regular guests know where you're phoning in from.
Yeah, I'm joining from Seattle, Washington in the United States. Yeah. All the way up in the Pacific Northwest corner.
Yeah, I used to live in Seattle. It's a wonderful place. So I'm a little jealous right now.
Welcome. I see some more joining from Peru.
Hello, Santi, Chiclayo, Peru. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, Luis. Also Chiclayo.
Wow. Well, great. As you continue to join, please jump into the comments and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. We'll give a quick reminder that tomorrow, Friday, March 17th at 2 p.m. Lima time, we'll be hosting a post-webinar discussion. So as you hear about this topic today, as you're joining and engaging in the comments, if questions come up and you want to keep talking with Duff and I, you can join us tomorrow in the post-webinar discussion. The link will be added to Facebook right after the end of this webinar.
Yeah.
And next month, the webinar will be on Thursday, April 20th. So make sure you mark your calendars for that.
Mm-hmm.
I see lots more joining from Peru. Hello.
Yeah, and I can add, I think the topic for next month is about feedback to students, right?
Yeah, I think that's the plan. So Daniel will be here to talk to us all about that next month.
Great.
Okay. Well, I'll pass it over to you, Duff, then, to take it away with all this content.
Well, welcome, everybody. It's great to see some of you in the chat and to learn where you are. I hope today you'll also give me some of your comments, some of your experiences, your ideas about our topic today, which is formative assessment. And I'd like to start by seeing what you think, seeing what your definition of formative assessment is, if you have one. So quite briefly, can you answer this question for me? Why do we use formative assessment? So what's the reason, the rationale, or the purpose for using formative assessment? If you have an idea, write a brief comment in the chat and we'll take a couple minutes and see what you have to say. Why do we use formative assessment? What's the reason for it? Mhm. Yeah. To see progress. Mhm. A similar answer, to see development of competences. To keep track on students' performance. Yeah, so this idea of time, overtime, progress. Yep. So why do we use formative assessment? Just another half minute. If you have comments, please write them. Yep. To know students' progress, yes. Very important, Jenny. Giving ongoing feedback, not just at the end of a class or the end of a test, but throughout a course, every week, every lesson, maybe. Yep. Melissa, to record the progress of skills in students. Very important. Yeah. So progress, development of skills, competence. All right. Well, I like asking questions like this before I start working with an audience or a group of teachers or students, because I need to know what you think, what you know, what you have experienced before I can talk to you more. Now, I've prepared a short presentation, but I want to use what you give me, your comments, to help me as I talk with you and discuss more with you. So lots of great ideas here. Formative assessment is ongoing. You track progress over time, and you're tracking progress in student performance, student competence, student development. In addition to tracking, you're also giving students feedback, telling them how they're doing, what they're doing right, maybe how they could improve. Yep. Yeah. Santi, I really like your comment. It'll help you to plan the next class. This is really important. So it's not just, in my opinion, not just about seeing how students are doing and giving them feedback. It's also about using what you're seeing to change or maybe improve your teaching. Yep. Yep. Very good. Let's continue. I have another question for you on the next slide. Now, we've talked about the reason for using formative assessment, and I really like what you've written. These are the standard reasons why we use formative assessment. Now I want to talk about what are the activities or practices we use with formative assessment. In other words, how do we use formative assessment? Now, there are many, many different things we can and do with formative assessment. But what are some of the formative assessment practices that you use or that you have seen used before? Let's take a couple of minutes and see what your experiences have been. How do we use, or how do you use, formative assessment? So please take a minute, think, reflect, and if you have something to say, write a brief comment in the comment chat. So
As
what?
everyone. Oh, go ahead. No, I was going to say I could offer an example while our participants are thinking about their comments. For me, one way that I use formative assessment is by giving students time to talk to each other, like a turn and talk or a sharing time where they're talking to each other. And I will walk around the class and listen in on their conversations. And that gives me an idea of what they're understanding as I hear them respond to a prompt that I've given them as a check for their understanding. So that's one way that I use formative assessment.
Yeah. So that could be with almost anything. It could be with a reading, something they're listening to. It could be with a topic you're discussing. maybe even grammar points or vocabulary, slang. It's very flexible, right? So let's see what some people have written. Yeah. Role plays, diagnostic test. Yeah. I think even something called a diagnostic test could be considered a form of formative assessment, depending on how you use it. Okay, so I'm looking at Santi's response: role plays, discussions, debates, wonderful, and ask and answer questions about an event. So I assume, Santi, you're thinking that students ask and answer questions with each other, not the teacher asking. Or maybe it's the teacher asking. Okay. Let's see. Role plays, yeah. It's good to see so many people are using role play situations. If you're working on everyday English or everyday situations, role plays are very, very helpful. I find that students actually relax a lot and they actually have fun with the activity. They get to be different people for a minute and say things maybe they would never say in real life. Yes. Thank you, Santi. Student to student. Yeah. So this is interesting. Cece, we use it to help students identify their strengths and weaknesses. So there's something here about having students gain knowledge about themselves and their progress, but also maybe taking some responsibility or ownership of that. So they're not only relying on a teacher to tell them how they're doing, they're maybe internalizing an idea of how they're doing. They're able to evaluate themselves. Comprehensive feedback. Millie Nell, I'm interested. Comprehensive feedback. What do you mean? Comprehensive means everything. So I'm wondering what's included in that. Yeah. All right, so this is great. Lots of great ideas. Something I hadn't included in this presentation is the idea of role plays. And this is something the teacher might set it up, but the students are the ones running it. They're planning, they're practicing, maybe they're performing in front of the class. And so even though the teacher has to guide things, the students are running it themselves. And you can give all sorts of feedback based on that. The teacher can give feedback, but if it's a performance in front of classmates, students can give feedback too, what they liked, what could be different or better, other things. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So very briefly, here's my agenda today. We don't have a ton of time, not a lot of time. So I just want to cover a few points with you. I'm not going to tell you everything about formative assessment, but I want to cover these points. What is the relationship between summative assessment and formative assessment? And this is something I think most teachers think about because they do need to do both kinds, or they definitely need to do summative assessment. But what role can formative assessment play when you think about summative assessment? I also want to go to something I think is very important, which are two conceptions of formative assessment. I'm really glad that you and I had a chance to talk on chat because it helped me understand what your concept of formative assessment is. And maybe I can add some new ideas, some complementary ideas that will help you broaden or expand your idea of formative assessment and maybe actually improve your teaching and student learning. And very briefly, I want to give some examples of formative assessment practices. This is not a total list, and some of these are things I have not done myself, but these are ideas that you might find useful, and they might inspire you to try new things or do some of your own research to find more practices. All right, let's go to the next slide. So when people talk about summative assessment and formative assessment, they often put them in opposition to each other. A lot of people will say summative assessment is bad. Formative assessment is good, it's positive, it's supportive. So here's an example of a contrasting list I found in one of the books I have here in my apartment. Take a look at some of the language in both lists. Do you think that the authors of this book, the authors who created this little chart, this table, have a preference for summative or formative assessment? What kind of language and word choice do they use? Just think about it for a second. Katie, do you have any opinions? I mean, do the authors show a bias towards one or the other forms of assessment?
I mean, I'm looking at the summative assessment column and I see the words controlling, authority-driven, evaluative, teacher-directed, and in contrast to the formative side, that's empowering, informative, process-oriented. So my hunch is that formative assessment is preferred in this exam.
Exactly. Words like growth-driven. Growth is positive in most cases, right? And in many places, like the United States, for example, words like traditional, authority, controlling, final, they have a very negative feel to them. So in the history of education, I think formative assessment really, the concept of it and the practice of it partly arose or partly developed to form a more positive, supportive, human face to evaluating students, assessing students. But here are a couple of reflective questions I'd like you to think about. Are summative and formative assessments always in such strong contrast? Are they always opposed to each other in terms of the language we can use to talk about them? And beyond that, how do summative assessment and formative assessment work together? So I'm not going to ask you to write anything, although you can. Summative assessment is necessary in some cases. I would say almost every classroom is going to require you to do some kind of summative assessment, to give some grade, to give some number, some score. So yes, summative assessment is required, but what's the role between formative and summative? What's the relationship? Do they always have to be so different or so opposed in the language we use to talk about them? How does formative assessment work with summative assessment? Just think about that for a second. And you can write a comment if you feel moved to do so. Melissa, formative assessment is flexible, no time limit perhaps. I like that idea. But summative assessment gives you a time limit to show a quick result, I think. That can often be the case. Summative assessments have very strict guidelines, maybe how you take the test, how much time you have, what the right and wrong answers are. Whereas there might be more flexibility with formative assessment. Maybe the time is not so important. Maybe there are many different correct or partially correct answers, right? So Jenny, they work together to provide feedback. Yes. During a course, but also at the end. I like that idea, Jenny. In a way, formative and summative assessment are kind of working together, and they just have different time frames. One is over a period of time, a length of time, it's ongoing, and one is maybe a snapshot, one moment in time, usually at the end of something. The end of a unit, the end of a course, the end of a degree or a school program. That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. Yes, thank you for your comments. I would also argue in many places, summative assessment has become more like formative assessment. Instead of having a test where you have 2 hours to complete it and you sit by yourself at a desk, sometimes summative assessment can seem more like formative assessment. Students might give a performance that doesn't have a strict number grade, but has a more holistic or open grade for completing the assignment. So I think over time, in many countries, summative assessment has started to resemble formative assessment in important ways. It's become less authority-driven, less controlling, and maybe more alternative. Maybe the summative assessment is putting on a play for your school. So things that were not traditionally summative assessment are now becoming summative assessment in many places. All right, let's move on. Next, please. So when I asked you earlier about what is the reason or the purpose for using formative assessment, a lot of people talked about observing and evaluating student progress, their work, and then providing feedback to help students improve. And in education, a lot of people say this is the main reason, or maybe the only real reason we do formative assessment, is to track student progress over time and to know how to give feedback, to intervene with students, to give them support, suggestions, ideas how to improve on their own. But I think it's also important to think about formative assessment as a way to think about our teaching and to maybe improve our teaching. If we think about formative assessment is also about improving our teaching over time, I think it can be very powerful and lead us to take on new frames of mind, but also try new activities. So let me just read briefly my definition of formative assessment to improve teaching. This kind of formative assessment is regular teaching observation and evaluation of student work to reflect on and improve teaching practices, which in turn should improve student learning. So even when we talk about improving teaching, our end goal is to help students learn better, right? So I want you to keep these two ideas in mind. We're going to talk about a few activities that we can do with formative assessment in our courses, in our classrooms. Some of them will be focused on seeing student learning and helping them improve. But other activities will be focused on seeing our teaching and improving our teaching whenever possible. So let's see. Santi is talking about the principles of the Ministry of Education. You have to give a final score. Parents need to see their kids score. One thing we're going to talk about, Santi, is that formative assessment, as wonderful as it can be and as positive as it can be, may be limited in our teaching context. We as teachers have a lot of constraints. We have our school administrator. We have a Ministry of Education. We have limited time. Maybe our classroom is full of students and we can't actually observe and give feedback to everybody often. So formative assessment, while wonderful, will not work for everyone or in every situation very well. So that's something we need to think about. And I know you've thought about if you've thought about formative assessment before. All right, let's go on. So here's what we're going to say here. And I'm just going to follow up on my last set of comments. Formative assessment can be done very informally, asking a student a comprehension question in the classroom without planning. But many forms of formative assessment require some planning and structure. And part of that is because for formative assessment to really work, both teachers and students need to believe in it. There are a lot of educators who say formative assessment or this formative assessment practice is wonderful. It will change everything, and do it. Sometimes a school administrator will say everybody must do peer review of writing. This is the best practice in writing instruction. Everybody must do peer review in their writing classes. But what happens if the teacher doesn't understand and doesn't believe in peer review? Do you think they're going to have good peer review sessions in that class? I can say from personal experience, that's not very likely. About 20 years ago, when I first heard about peer assessment, it was required in my classes. But it took me a couple of years for me to understand how peer assessment of writing works and for me to see how students benefit from it. So simply saying formative assessment will change everything automatically is not right. Teachers need to believe in it. Students need to believe in it. Yeah. Yes. And great, Aurelia, great comment. The use of each will depend on the purpose of your class. Exactly. One model does not fit every class, every lesson, every context. I would argue also that formative assessment, especially very involved ones like peer review of student writing, takes a routine. You can't just do it once or twice in a class because students won't be familiar with it. They won't know what you expect of them, and they won't have the practice to really make it work well. So it has to be part of a routine, and that takes time. And this also requires teachers to be flexible. If they have a very rigid lesson plan, or if they don't plan their lessons and somebody tells them exactly what they have to do, there may not be a lot of flexibility to build those formative assessment routines and have them work effectively. If you're using formative assessment also to reflect on and maybe improve your teaching, you need flexibility to make change. Last couple of points. Because flexibility is needed, there usually needs to be some form of institutional or administrative support and acceptance. Because if your administrator or the Ministry of Education only wants results on summative assessment, they may not believe that what you want to do with formative assessment actually helps improve scores, improve learning. So you need to be able to, either you start with a school, an administrator that believes in formative assessment, or you might have to convince people that what you're doing actually works. And you have to show them evidence probably. For all these reasons, I don't think formative assessment or some forms of it will work in some schools, or maybe even most schools. Yeah. Yes, exactly, Aurelia. Just as there is more than one form of FA and essay. Exactly. Yes, exactly, Karen. You have to believe in peer assessment in order to use it in class. That's the same with everything we do, right? If we give a reading to students that we don't like the reading, we don't like the story, we don't understand it, how is our teaching with that story going to be? So teachers really need to believe in what they're doing. They need to understand it. They need to see the benefits so they can share that enthusiasm, that belief with their students. If you're going to take time to build routines of formative assessment or work with a reading, you need to have students buy in. They need to believe and follow you. All right, let's continue. Okay, so a lot of people, when we talk about formative assessment to see and improve student learning, most people tend to talk about teachers doing this. So it's the teachers observing. Maybe it's the teachers giving comprehension checks, giving diagnostic quizzes that don't really have points, and then giving feedback to students on what they did wrong, what they did right, how they might improve. So because this is a very common understanding of what formative assessment to improve learning is about, I want to focus on a couple other kinds of formative assessment that can give valuable feedback to students, but don't involve teachers in exactly the same way. So as I was talking about earlier, as we were talking about, peer assessment is a classic example where it's students who are observing, paying attention to what their partners are doing, their classmates are doing, and they are providing the feedback, the criticism or critique, maybe suggestions for improvement, maybe praise for doing a good job. So peer assessment shifts some of the burden or some of the job of observing student learning and also giving feedback away from the teacher and to the students. There are a number of benefits to this. I think you probably know. We'll talk about a couple of them a little bit later. Another very popular form of formative assessment to improve learning is self-assessment. And this could be things like using a rubric to grade your presentation or your essay. It could also involve more reflective writing, like a journal, or something like a portfolio, where students collect their work, maybe even graded work, over the course of a unit or maybe a course, a semester, and they reflect on what they've done. They track their own progress, their own development. They look at their own artifacts in a portfolio and they note changes like my title got better in my essays, or I can write a better thesis statement now than I could at the beginning of the semester. So self-assessment is another way to involve students in the job of observing, evaluating, and also giving feedback. I'm going to also argue for something that not everybody agrees with, but I think there are other ways to use forms of authentic performance with people outside of class as a form of formative assessment. And here I'm not talking about giving a graded play at the end of a course or creating a video and then getting a grade for that. We're talking about things that are very low stakes, either no grade or just participation points, or maybe even on a voluntary basis. So here are some examples that I have used. Having a guest come into your class, asking students on a voluntary basis to ask questions. Maybe play 20 questions. The students need to find out who this person is, why they are in the classroom. And if you do this on a voluntary basis, students can test themselves. If they don't have a lot of experience talking with, let's say, strangers, or maybe in some cases a native speaker, if you bring a native speaker of the target language into your class, they can see how well they're understood. It's one thing when your teacher understands a question and responds to you. Teachers are supposed to do that. Teachers are supposed to work hard even when you don't have great English. But what happens when you have to talk to a stranger, maybe a native speaker? How do students find they did? I think a lot of students will find that they could do it. And that can be just the fact that a stranger will respond to them and give them a good answer is proof that they can do this. Maybe they can travel to another country, another city, and use English with people they don't know. Another idea that I think works well, I haven't done it, but I know teachers who have, is to have their students go to another classroom and actually teach a lesson. And this could be students at a lower level or even students at the same level. They will see from their students, their own students' performance in the lesson, how well they're doing. Are they teaching the concept well, the grammar or the vocabulary well? And this is a way to test their own performance, their own knowledge. With all of these low stakes performance techniques, I do feel giving them some time and a space, a place to reflect on what they've done can be very useful. The experience itself might be useful, but sitting with it and thinking about it can be doubly useful. So, quick question. Let's take a couple of minutes. Have you used any of these techniques yourself? Or do you have other formative assessment techniques that don't involve the teacher observing, evaluating, and giving feedback? So have you used any of these practices? If you have, write a comment.
I see a comment from Nadia. Yeah. It looks like they use peer assessment and self-assessment.
Yeah. Nadia, if you do use both forms, can you tell us about some of the peer assessment you use? Or maybe self-assessment? Do you use it with writing or other things? Yeah. Great comment, Romy. Self-assessment is also very important. It helps students to know themselves, right? Yeah. I think it's hard to really grow in life if we don't have a lot of self-knowledge. That applies to all areas of life, and it definitely applies in a language classroom. If they are constantly relying on a teacher to tell them how they're doing, they may not be very active in their learning in some ways. They will not be able to tell when they're doing a good job. So Nadia, peer assessment, written work. Yes. As I was saying earlier, this is the classic example of peer assessment. You find it a lot with writing, and I've used it a lot myself, although it took me many years to actually feel comfortable using it all the time. Katie, have you used any of these?
Yeah,
techniques?
I love to use self-assessment as formative assessment. The idea of having a portfolio where students collect their work over
Yeah,
an amount of time and then giving students space to reflect on their progress is one of my favorite practices. It's
yeah,
really helpful to have a rubric in those situations also so they can see how they're growing over time.
right. And Jenny makes a good point that a lot of the group work we have them do, writing a text together, for example, does involve decision making and giving each other feedback like, I think our thesis statement could be better. So in a way, instead of saying your work could be better, it's our work could be together. This is kind of a collective language use situation. Yeah. Santi, great point. A lot of students, when they realize that their feedback is helpful, they love doing it. Yeah. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. So these are some of the benefits that we can talk about. There are many more, and we've already talked about some of them in our discussion today. When you're doing formative assessment that's not led by the teacher, students can take more responsibility for their work. They're more active learners. They have to be thinking more often and not just waiting for the teacher to tell them what to do or for the teacher to evaluate them. They can also internalize what good learning or good performance means because they have to be responsible to work with others or even themselves. If you're doing peer interaction, it's a great way to practice spoken or written interaction with people and develop lots of great social skills like decision making, agreeing and disagreeing, taking leadership roles, deferring to other people's ideas or opinions. And here's a really great point. I think when you're using other forms of feedback, especially peer feedback or outside feedback, you get comments from other people. Now, most students know the teacher's comments are important and they respect them. But sometimes I think students will tune off teacher feedback if they think, well, that's just the teacher. Nobody else really sees that. But if their classmates are saying, yeah, this title is not good, or if they talk with somebody outside of class and they notice something, they might take that more seriously than the teacher who always gives them feedback or comments. So multiple vectors or multiple sources of feedback might reach students in different ways, and it can be very powerful. And if done right, if set up right, I think many of these alternative feedback, observation, evaluation, and feedback assessments can allow teachers to take on a different role, more of a guide than the strict instructor or evaluator. But again, you have to set up these assessments wisely. Just because you do them doesn't mean you're going to work less. In fact, even if you do them right, you might work just as much, but in a different way. Some people will argue that certain forms of peer or self-assessment means teachers can reduce the amount of time they give feedback to students. And I don't know if I believe this, because I do a lot of peer assessment and self-assessment, but I still spend a lot of time making comments on student writing, for example. But I have heard some teachers say, well, if I do more peer review, let's say I have 4 drafts of a paper, I won't comment on the 3rd draft because the peers will. And they'll get feedback from me on the 1st and 2nd drafts. So, all right, let's move to the next slide. All right, here's what I really am interested in talking about, because I don't think a lot of people think about improving teaching when we talk about formative assessment. I'm a big believer in reflective teaching. I've been a teacher educator, a teacher, of course, and I think if you are not reflecting on your teaching, even if you've been teaching for decades, you're probably not doing as good of a job as you could be. Maybe you're not being in touch with your students. Because even if you know the material well, you might not be seeing how your student population is changing, how their needs might change, how technology might change the teaching and learning environment. So some of the ways to use formative assessment to reflect on and maybe improve your teaching are these. These are not the only ones, but these are some popular ones. And I think all of us do some of these, even if we don't think of them formally as formative assessment. So taking notes in a lesson, after a lesson, what worked, what didn't work, what activity needs more time. Also, a lot of teachers keep journals, formal or informal, where they reflect on a class, the students, but also the content, the activities. I would argue that all of us, every single lesson we teach, we are doing formative assessment. Just as we're responding to what students are doing for us, we're also responding to, how did that activity work? Can I do it better? So how can I improve? Let's say I'm going to teach this lesson again in the afternoon or tomorrow or next semester. Well, how can I do it better next time? So we're always involved as practicing teachers evaluating ourselves. And I think we should think about this as a form of formative assessment. Yep. Great learning and advanced way of teaching. Right. Okay, let's move on to peer evaluation. And this can be sensitive. Asking other teachers, other colleagues to give us feedback can be sensitive. I know some of us feel stressed or embarrassed. Maybe we don't feel that our teaching is good enough. Maybe we think others will be negative. But I think we all use some form of peer evaluation, even if we're back in our office or around the water cooler at lunch talking to our colleagues. We might complain about a lesson that bombed, a lesson of ours that didn't work well. But I also think we can think about using more structured, routine ways of getting peer feedback. There are many ways where you can ask teachers to critique your work, bring in an activity that you created, show some examples of student work, ask them to tell you what they see, both with the assignment or activity you created, but also on the work that students did. See if they can give you ideas to improve. This requires being humble, generous, and taking a bit of a risk. It may not be possible in a lot of schools if you don't have time to talk to each other, to collaborate together, but it's something that could be another form of formative assessment to improve your teaching and improve your students' learning. Finally, ask your students to evaluate you. You can do this indirectly by asking them to give you exit tickets. So at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit, ask them to evaluate what they've learned. If you've given them criteria, things they're supposed to learn and be able to do, ask them to evaluate themselves. If they don't feel, or some of them don't feel that they've improved that much or improved at all, maybe you need to think about what you're doing. Yes, you can focus on maybe some students who need some extra help, but is there something you can do to maybe help the class as a whole or to provide extra help in a lesson for students who are still struggling? You can also very bluntly ask students to give you feedback in surveys. Maybe this works with more mature students, but I think even younger students can tell you what they think about the class. Things like making this anonymous, making it low pressure, and then also showing them that you are listening to what they're saying and trying to make changes, trying to support them, I think can make a powerful difference. So you can reflect yourself, ask peers to evaluate and give you feedback, but you can also ask students to do that too. All right, next slide. Yeah, I'm talking for a long time. So to recap, I think that formative and summative assessment need to work together. They're not in opposition. If formative assessment doesn't connect with and support summative assessment, then it's probably not really useful in your classroom. Again, I think formative assessment, we need to have a very broad expansive understanding. It's not just to see, evaluate, and improve student learning. It's to see, evaluate, and improve our teaching. Also, can't say it strongly enough, formative assessment, some forms of it will not work everywhere. Ask yourself what you can do, what people are already doing at your school, and see what is possible. I think if you think about it a bit more, maybe look at some more examples, it may inspire some effective new ways to teach and effective new ways for your students to learn. So that's it from me. We have a couple wrap-up slides and some resources at the end. Do you want to take over, Katie?
Sure. Yeah. So thank you, Duff. That was a great representation of the vast variety of formative assessment opportunities for teachers and for students. Come tomorrow at 2 p.m. Lima time. Bring your questions, bring your ideas. We'll talk tomorrow at the post-webinar discussion. So you'll find that link in the Facebook feed.
Yeah.
And then next month, join us on April 20th, 2 p.m. Mark your calendars. We'll see you then in April. And I'll leave with the resources here on the screen for more learning.
These are all videos. I think formative assessment, like many teaching practices, you need to see it to believe it. So simply reading a description doesn't work. So these are a lot of videos you can find online. American English from the RELO, associated with the RELO office, and there are other videos. So take a look. I've tried to organize them for you. Have a great afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.